Hello and welcome to everyone who's joined these Business Day Dialogues live in partnership with UNISA Graduate School of Business Leadership. I'm Joanne Joseph. Lovely to be with you as always. As you're aware, we're going to be discussing a topic that's been in the public consciousness for some time now, the fate of the country's flagship carrier, South African Airways. After a long period of severe disruption, SAA takes to the skies again soon. But the last almost year and a half have been extremely tough for the airline and its staff. After being grounded, SAA was put into business rescue. It's just emerged from that process. And there's a strong possibility that the main shareholder, the Public Enterprises Department, will sell a significant stake of 51% to Dagazzo, a Black-owned private company, which, if it came off, would make the state and the private sector partners in this enterprise. Now, all of that is still subject to regulatory approval, and that's why our discussion today will not focus on the details of that deal. But we will look at SAA's transition in the last few months, what business rescue has entailed, how it's emerged out of that, and what is expected of the airline's performance in the next few months. We're also going to look at this from a more theoretical perspective, and that really looks at what can be drawn from the experiences of this nature. That's why the voices of UNISA SBL form an important part of the discussion this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Acting Academic Director at UNISA SBL, Mr. Andile Nobachi, to foreground our discussion for us. Andile manages the academic portfolio's resources in accordance with the relevant principles and policies of UNISA, and this includes the effective utilization of staff, the maintenance of discipline, promotion of sound employee relations and equity, and proper use and care of UNISA property. He, of course, participates in the institutional-wide policy and management structures, and he's responsible for the coordination and the integration of business school activities for the rest of UNISA. And let me hand over to you now.
Thank you, Joanne. You're so kind. And good evening to you and good evening to everyone out there. A warm welcome to you all to this evening's talk about SAA's new strategic path as it takes to the skies. The objective here is to have the participants share knowledge and demonstrate the intricate relationship between leadership and corporate governance. As the business school, we put emphasis on employing engaged scholarship, where our academic rigor and research experience intersects with the research with rich non-academic experience to contribute effectively to resolving business and societal challenges for public good. We are resolute that an integrated and collaborative approach through public-private partnerships will enable us to develop best management practices that can be shared in all sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce to you my fellow panelists. The interim CEO at SAA, Mr. Thomas Pogole. He is a chartered accountant with an MBA degree from the Gordon Institute of Business Science. He chairs the Mine Workers Provident Fund's Board of Directors and is also a non-executive director at CISO Medical Fund. Thomas previously worked as the Chief Financial Officer at the Competition Commission of South Africa and more recently, Interim Chief Executive Officer at the Air Traffic Navigation Services. Second panelist, faculty from the SBL, Ms. Lerato Ngosi. She's a senior lecturer in economics in the postgrad in business administration and also our master's program. She's also the program manager of the management development program in BBBE. Lerato holds a master's degree in economics from UNISA. Her research interests lie in econometrics and public economics, with a particular interest in public finance and state-owned enterprises. Lerato is so passionate about educating communities about economic issues such as unemployment, public institutions, and education paths to success. Thank you, and back to you, Joanne.
Andile, thank you so much for that. And thanks for doing the honors with introducing the panel that we are about to speak to. Before we do that, of course, I just want to remind our audience, we really welcome your questions during these discussions. Love to have your input. All you have to do is make use of the chat function. And at the end of our discussion, which runs for about 45 minutes, I then go to some of those questions. I take as many as I can, and I put them to the panelists that you've requested me to do that to. So please feel free to start sending those messages through. We really appreciate that interaction with you. So you have been introduced to the panel. Thomas Gokolo, the interim CEO of SAA as it stands. Lerato, Senior Lecturer in Economics, Program Manager of the Management Development Program in BBEE at UNISA SBL. Welcome to you both. Andile, you're going to stay with us for the duration of the panel as well. Thomas, I want to start with you and just remind us, and we know that SAA has emerged from a really traumatic chapter in its history. How did it end up in business rescue?
All right. Good evening, and good evening to the participants, and more importantly to the loyal customers of SAA. It is great to be hosted here today. SAA had financial troubles, and those financial troubles took place over a period of time. What do I mean by that? It was generating operating losses, and a build up to that was that. As you were building these operating losses, eventually on your balance sheet, you start getting to a point where you've got more liabilities than assets, which means that you are then insolvent. And when SAA got to that point at the time, the board and the shareholder then decided that it is important that it goes into business rescue to see if there is an opportunity to really clean up the liabilities and be able to bring back an airline that can be much more sustainable. That's how they found themselves in insolvency and eventually into business rescue.
So they've now exited, or you all have exited the business rescue process. How successful would you say it's been?
We have now exited the business rescue. That was the end of April. There was a lot of work that was achieved in terms of the liabilities that we had. A lot of those were compromised, and arrangements were entered into with the creditors that some of them will be paid over a period of 3 years. Some of them have already been paid. I will say it's successful in a sense that out of business rescue, we got what we call a solvent SAA. Before then, it was insolvent, and out of business rescue, it became solvent. So on that space, I would say it is successful. But from an operational efficiency, there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of legacy systems, legacy processes, and to also be able to see if the market will still receive us very well. But from a solvency point of view, it was indeed a success out of the BRP.
All right. Lerato, you're looking at this from an academic point of view, as well as the practical point of view, because you work very closely closing the gap between theory and application. Why is SAA such a fascinating study for you and your students?
SAA is quite a fascinating study because there's quite a good merger between the theoretical and the practical applications that we can learn from SAA. From a theoretical perspective, firstly, you have to understand what type of firm, company you have, whether it's public or private, and thereafter that will inform the type of theory or understanding that you should have about managing that company. So one of the most interesting theories that can be applied to SAA is the issue of the principal agent theory, for example, where you have the government that is the principal and the agent, which is management. So you can apply that theory with business rescue. You can apply the theory of stakeholder theory, because there were a lot more people involved in business rescue rather than just the principal and the agent. And then from a practical perspective, it has so much value because it equips you as a manager, as a leader, to be able to apply any lessons that you've drawn from the history of SAA, from the business rescue, from an organizational perspective, from a leadership perspective, from a perspective of understanding, pricing decisions. Thomas has already said that going forward with the new SAA, they want to give the customer a better experience. So perhaps issues of, price discrimination, how should you go about that, re-establishing SAA and recalculating and understanding its competitive structure, because it's not only competitive from a domestic perspective, but also continental and global. So there are many lessons that we can learn from SAA, but one thing that is quite important from a leadership perspective as well, and management, the two merge together, are the issues of ethics and corruption. Because what Thomas talked about, issues in a company, like legacy issues, tend to filter through the life cycle of a business. So issues of corporate governance, high board turnover, making sure that there are more constraints on problematic spending or wasteful expenditure. Those are the things that we can use and apply from an organizational and leadership perspective.
That's one thread, Lerato, that's run throughout our discussions with UNISA SBL every time we have them, the issue of leadership and the focus, Andile, that UNISA SBL constantly puts on leadership. Now it's interesting that Lerato's also spoken about the issue of corruption and ethics and how important that is, how much of a part of the DNA of leadership we need that to become in the country. Just talk me through that. When you look at a case study like this, like SAA, Andile, what are the sort of lessons we ought to learn and that you are able to convey to students who are theoretically studying the example of SAA in terms of leadership and ethics?
Well, first and foremost, Joanna, is that as part of UNISA, we currently busy with the curriculum transformation agenda, and that focuses on the on infusing African epistemologies into our curriculum, but not only limited to that, to really extend that to engage scholarship. Our identity as the school, we have got 4 focus areas that ethical and responsible leadership is part of that. But really, we want to do good. So the emphasis is on public good. So when you come across a case study like this, you want to see any indications of that being expressed, because we're able then to take that and infuse it into our curriculum programs. It becomes important then because we have been criticized as the tertiary institutions, that the focus has really been on the theory perspective, it's really been on the Western epistemologies. But now, when you get a case study of a domestic entity, there is navigating the future, and we certainly want to be part of that agenda, really navigating the future, because no one would have been, by any stretch of imagination, anticipated what we've experienced through COVID, the pandemic. So it's quite important then, and also we want to put the kind of a graduate that we want to put out there at the labor market, as somebody who is well-rounded, somebody who's going to hit the ground and make a difference, not only to the employer, but to the societal challenges as well. So we look in a case study like this, we look at the leadership competencies that really make a difference in this direction that we're driving, making a difference out there. So it gets quite exciting and important when you listen to what Thomas and team has been dealing with. And when I was listening to him now, is that he was looking across at all the business functions, because sometimes what we tend to do, we tend to pick up a financial perspective and look at it in isolation from the rest of the operations, yet the operations have got an impact on that financial perspective. So when you see a case study where it is demonstrated that there's an integrated approach that features a cross-functional teams in really resolving the issues, we take that. We take those learnings, and they not only go and filter in, Joe, into our academic programs, but we want them. We're running a business leadership where we're focusing on SMEs, and the real beauty of that is that you've got a real life challenge, real life problems that really need resolutions and solutions to that. And when you've got your students who have been exposed to what people at SAA are doing. We're able to take that and go and help that small little, for instance, a BME down in Port St. John's. So those are the exciting things that we really derive. We can't see the synergy and the resonance between these this strategic journey, the emerging strategic journey that come and really influence what we teach in the classroom. Thank you, Joe.
Dile, don't be surprised if one of your students is sitting there writing up the methodology for exactly this kind of thesis. Thomas, let me bring you back in here. What have been your biggest learnings during this business rescue process at SAA?
Very interesting, Joanne. When you look at the books of SAA, as far back as 1994, even pre-democracy, SAA back in 1994 was about 2.5 billion rand revenue business already then. And you see it growing throughout. Even before COVID, it was at about, I think it had hit about 30 billion rand in terms of revenue. And then you ask yourself, how can a business that has been showing such a healthy, but yes, a bit of a challenging level of revenue growth go down? So that is one of the things that the lesson I learned as well is that there's a certain role that management did well, and it was to grow the revenue. But there was one area that the previous leadership could have done better, and that is managing cost. Because what then happens is that the company was not building reserves or enough reserves for environments like this one of COVID. Like many other companies, of course, those who were building reserves were likely to survive this COVID environment. But what we have learned throughout business rescue as well is the complexity of stakeholders that are involved and the amount of emotions that they bring in. Joanne, I mean, you are my creditor and I owed you money. I'm not going to be paying you a full amount because I need to comprise that. You feel aggrieved. And subsequent to business rescue, I'm coming back to you again. I'm saying, let's do business together. And then you remind me that, no, but you owe me money from the past as well. What we've also learned out of business rescue as well is that sometimes because it is a legal process, and there's an issue of rationalizing the organization, it doesn't give the business rescue practitioners enough time to really think sustainably long-term for the organization. Because what do? You give people VSPs, and the unintended consequences of giving people voluntary service packages is that your best soldiers sometimes leave, right? And then when you start to rebuild the business, you might not have a balance of those who were strong and those who are slightly needing a bit of development as well. So those are some of the lessons that we're picking up as well. But one of the key lessons over and above that is the issue of the brand damage that a BRP does, especially for a public sector entity. Most people don't know that one of our fellow competitors, ComAir, went into business rescue twice already. But you don't see that being vocalized on the market. Now we are a public sector entity, and rightfully so, because we use public sector money that we need to be held accountable. So it does a lot of brand damage. So out of business rescue, you're not really wrestling with issue of rents and cents only. You're looking at, will the customer still use SAA service knowing that we are in BRP? And by the way, we did not go into BRP because our safety levels were low. We went into BRP because of money issues. So sometimes these issues get conflicted and people can't distinguish what was the problem there as well. So that is one thing that we've learned out of BRP. And also, what makes it even more hard is that doing a BRP during a pandemic environment where the market is very subdued. Remember, SAA is a full service airline. We are not a low cost carrier. So you'll see that even our pricing as well is slightly above what you will get at a low cost carrier environment. So what then happens is that your consumer is constrained and you want them to then come and utilize your facilities as well. That creates a problem. But in general, the lockdowns as well have not been much more helpful as well. So restarting an airline out of BRP is a tough job, Joey, but doing it during a COVID environment is even tougher. So there's some broad lessons that we learn out of BRP, but what is important is that we can use BRP in a good way of saving jobs. We can use BRP in a way of really still resuscitating the companies that without BRP, they could have been liquidated.
I want to come back to that point in a moment, Thomas, but the brand damage issue is a big one. And I want Lerato to actually just delve into this a little bit for me. Lerato, brand damage, it can occur to the point where people will simply not go back to a brand. They will vote with their feet. They will not necessarily go back to a brand that's been tainted by corruption, mismanagement, whatever the case may be in the past. Lerato, how does SAA as a state-owned entity move away from that brand damage and try not to bring its old baggage with it as it moves forward?
Thanks, Joanne, for that question. And, the issue of brand damage is not only maybe from the platforms that are concerned with media, but also in scholarship as well. Because when you also read articles, you go through research, you look at the heavy criticisms, against business rescue, for instance. I'll give an example that in South Africa, business rescue, the Chapter 6 of the Companies Act that makes provisions for business rescue is not really popular, and it's not really a process that is well known in South Africa. And the fact that SAA as a state-owned enterprise is undergoing business rescue, I mean, anyone would view that, as so negative. They would view it really as maybe writing SAA off and saying, is there really anything to salvage? So the issue of brand management is very important. And one thing that can inform the turnaround strategy for SAA is really trying to create that buy-in first domestically among South Africans, and also working with Brand SA to do that. Because we're constantly seeing now, especially with the lockdowns, that because we are banned from international travel, a lot of us have been traveling more domestically and actually finding out about places that we didn't know, and finding out that we have such a beautiful country that a lot of us actually didn't know. So the issue of brand management, it's quite damaging, but it's also not easy, but it's feasible to build back the brand of a company by holding, webinars like this, for instance, by, going out on an extra limb so that users of SAA could go back to the brand and say, oh, okay, yes, I'm seeing a lot of things on the media that are quite negative, but after having sat down with Thomas today, I understand a lot more about the entity. Because I'll give you another example about Eskom. Eskom is heavily criticized, and yet, if you go there and you ask the people who are working for the entity, they're quite happy. They view Eskom as a very good employer. Also, Eskom is one of the best, or rather is the biggest generator of electricity in Africa, and its transmission line goes up to the DRC. So those are a lot of the positive things that we don't know about Eskom, because they are constantly, purported in the media, in academia, in scholarship. So brand management is not just a marketing strategy in terms of operations, but it's also about constantly bringing in academics, researchers to say, look, are you up to date actually with what's really happening, with the business rescue? If we're talking about business rescue, what was the problem? It's not as bad as we think. So scholarship and the practical and the operations of SAA should align actually to build the brand management again.
Yeah, there's some really great points there, Lerato. I want to go back to the issue of the business case with you for a moment here, Thomas. Your board chair, John Lamola, insists there's a strong business case for SAA going forward, but so many people are in doubt about that. I mean, I've heard people say all sorts of things. Why do we need a national carrier? There are many countries without a national carrier. They do just fine. How strong is there how strong a business case is there for an airline that has struggled so much in recent years?
Yes. let's start first, and with my statement I made earlier. This is an airline that over the years grew their revenue base to about 30 billion rand. So you get a sense that from a market perspective, people associated with the brand. And I don't think we'll have lost that market all of a sudden as well. I must admit that a lot of our customers are hurt because some of them had booked with us when we went to business rescue, and we are still processing those particular vouchers in terms of redeeming them. And we apologize for that. And it's something that we're trying to speed up as well. So why do we believe SAA has got a better business case? We acknowledge that the domestic market is highly competitive. We acknowledge that the regional market that we call the continental market is also highly competitive, but it's got opportunities. I'll give you an example. For example, if you look at the route between Lagos and Johannesburg, we don't have more than 3 competitors there. And there is quite a huge volume there. So we believe that those are the areas that we need to explore. If you look at our international routes as well, you look at the UK route, you look at the Germany route, you look at the USA route, and even Brazil as well. Those routes were generally revenue generating routes. What we did, because of our geographical location, we also used the old aircraft as well. So you burn more fuel doing those European routes and international routes, but more importantly, you are using not so updated equipment. So why do we believe we've got a better business case now is that we have kept those particular routes. And we believe that when the situation of COVID normalizes and we have done enough vaccination, and South Africa has moved from the red list internationally in terms of those countries, if we deploy the right aircraft, we should then be able to then still service those markets. One of the things is that if you are using the old equipment and it is not fuel efficient, it means that your ticket cost becomes much more high. So by us making sure that we can position the fleet planning, that we get the right fleet to then be able to do those particular trips, we should then be able to minimize our cost and then be able to compete. But one of the strategies we are going to do will deploy much more a collaborated way of doing business than just simply trying to be SAA and just going into the international market. Where we can do partnership with other airlines, whether you call them Emirates, whether you call them Qatar, we're going to look at those particular relationships and see if there is something to enhance out of that. But our focus now will be much more stimulating the regional market, making sure that the region is really connected, and then being able to then go back into the international base and then be able to then still continue with those particular markets. So we believe that based on the revenue base that we had before and how we have looked at the market, we have a strong case. And by the way, since we started opening our tickets about 2 weeks ago, we see that within Cape Town, we're still getting load factors of about 70 and 75%. That is good for a brand that we are trying to rebuild. What we are worried about is just the regional routes, because we see that overall there's not much of travel taking place there. So these are very encouraging, small pockets of success. What we need to work over time on is to make sure that the internal operational costs don't get out of hand, because if your internal operational cost gets out of hand, you are back to square one. So we need to be much more efficient by looking at remodeling some of our legacy IT systems, looking at how we can repurpose some of the assets that we have, and looking at how do we extract value out of employees and making sure that we compensate for the value add into the business as well. But more importantly as well, when you go to the market, you need to be cautious. You need to be data-led. So you need to analyze and make sure that at least you follow data. You don't want to go through these things emotionally through ego to say, look, we used to travel to Harare and I'm going to travel to Harare again. You need to be very careful. So we're not going to be telling the market that this is what you must do. The market must tell us what they want out of us. And then our other thing as well is that we simply need to get back to the basics. The arrogance of running an SAA as a state airline that everybody just travels with us because we are a state-owned entity, those days are over. We need to get off our offices and make sure that we get the basics right. The customer must arrive on time. The customer must get safety. The customer must be treated well at all costs. And we need to make sure that the customer journey with us is better by deploying things like technological tools where it can make your experience much more easier. Joanne, Lerato, if you complain to us, we need to address your complaints much more quicker and much more efficiently. So back to basics, the market is still there, but a very tough market. So if I were to sum it up this year, we've got a strong case because we're thinking from a collaboration point of view, re-looking at the kind of equipment we deploy and making sure that we make the customer journey much more better than how it was experienced in the past. There were good points in the past, we'll build up on that, but we need to rethink the entire customer journey throughout.
There are two important threads that you've mentioned there that I want to pick up on, Thomas. And Lerato, let me address the first one to you, this issue of data and research-based planning. It's really a pivotal one, I think. How important is that information gathering before one commits to the kinds of decisions this airline is making, Lerato?
Thank you, Joanne. I will put on my econometrician hat and talk about data. Data is very important, right? And when you are managing or you are part of a turnaround strategy at an entity such as SAA, you need the data to tell you a lot, right? So it's not enough for you to just look at the trends, look at maximum, minimums, peaks, troughs, seasonality, but a lot of your decisions around that data have to be informed by political events. So, for instance, with COVID, obviously, if you look at the data probably on ticket sales, air traffic, and the like, it's definitely going to be low. But generally, you need to think about it as someone who is part of a turnaround strategy to say, generally, if I look at this data, is it because of the issue of the brand, as we've just discussed? Is it an issue of the brand being affected by business rescue? Is it an issue of COVID regulations and people not traveling enough? Are people traveling more on the road rather than flight? So the data tells you a lot, but as someone who is using the data towards a certain strategy or goal, you need to explain and give economic rationale behind data. For instance, let's say if you look at the exchange rate, for instance, you look at the exchange rate from 1994 when South Africa got democracy, it appreciated very much. If you look at maybe SAA flights or air traffic at that time, you might find that there's a very strong correlation between that political event and SAA business. So that's why I say that sometimes data is not just a statistical exercise, but you also need to attach whatever events are going around in that data, both from an economic perspective and then at a micro level to look at the entity itself to say, okay, at this point, at this month, quarter or year, what was happening? Why are we seeing data that does not move towards our expectations? Or it's surprising that this is what we thought about SAA, but the data is showing us something else. So data is important, but you need to utilize the data not only as a statistician, but at an operational level as well.
You know, Andile, I want to draw attention to this issue of customer service because I think, in my view, it remains one of the real weaknesses in South African businesses. Many South African businesses of all sizes fail to actually engage customers the way they ought to and resolve the kind of problems that Thomas was alluding to a little bit earlier on. SAA is now at a point where it seems to be recognizing that. How do we change the way businesses like SAA do business with customers? How do they go about starting to centralize the customer experience rather than really just guess what they think the customer needs and build it around that?
And my answer to you, Joe, will kind of recap on your question about data. And I was just thinking that the strategic value of data is if it moves the needle in terms of the customer value. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. If ever it's not going to help Thomas to push down the cost structure, as he has mentioned, then why waste your time? It's not worth your dime. If it's not going to help him to generate cash so that he could drive his operations, what's the point? If it's not going to help him, he mentioned a collaborative approach where they're not only looking at their external stakeholders, but they're also considering, they're looking at their employees. In fact, everyone at SAA, Joe, should be a strategic business partner now. It should be impressed on everyone that your role is to make sure that there is SAA tomorrow, that SAA is sustainable. If then you get that engendered, if you get that espoused and permeates everything that you do within the SAA, that everyone needs to recognize that SAA is largely a service-oriented entity. SAA wants to recapture all that customer base. Nobody's going to come to you. Nobody's going to give you a second chance if they're not convinced that you're going to meet their needs, that you're focusing on them. And quite importantly, focusing on customers should be an integral component of everything that you do, integral component of your business model. Everything is every activity. What is its potential impact on the customers, particularly when you are an entity like SAA where your baggage already is weighing you down. And the sooner you kind of divorce yourself of that past and realize that the environment, the macroeconomic factors, the environment, your market environment has changed as well. You need to navigate a space now. So I would say to Thomas and Tim, the sooner they do that, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the learnings that they derived that got them into the BRP, they should be discarded. All that is gone. They've had that. It's a time of saying, where are we now? How do we make sure that we navigate the space and be competitive? And when I was listening to him about the collaborative approach, I think that's the best way to go. Going back to your question then, customers, because they need to generate revenue, I'm talking about the entity. So everything then has got to revolve around making sure what does your customer want. But it's also important that you start including them. So your stakeholder management approach, it becomes important here. You work with your customers in ensuring that SAA has got a future, that SAA is there tomorrow. Just like what Thomas mentioned, when they went to their creditors and say, we're very much aware that we owe you money, but it is in your interest that we work together in making SAA work again. That should be the same approach as well, that is looking at your customers. But you just have to be authentic there, not just paying lip service, but you've got to have demonstrable evidence that you're actually working on satisfying the customer need. So I would say the sooner that SAA stand up and say, actually, our customers are really an integral part of our business, it will give them a chance to really stand on their feet again, Joe. Thank you.
Thomas, board dynamics have got in the way in the past of SAA often being the successful carrier that it could have been. Where do you as the interim manager stand on the role of the board and its interactions with the various role players from this point onwards?
The role of the board is very important. We can never underestimate that they are responsible for the company. They are brought into the business by the shareholder. So for us, we see the board playing a key strategic role. More importantly, as management, we do implement the strategy, but we do a lot of discussions with the board. When you ask about the role of the board, you want an experienced board. You want a board that has got versatility in terms of skills. The board that will bring financial side of things, legal side of things. We are in aviation, and a board that will bring aviation experience as well. The board that will bring the leadership maturity that we need, because we deal with complex, tough issues. And you need those people who have got that that sense of maturity, who can guide. And you need a board that, can think forward, visionary wise, and not very short term wise as well. But more importantly, the base of that board should be built on, ethics, good sound ethics, and a respect for corporate governance. And if we get those things right, then they translate into a good customer experience, because we won't be in the newspapers for the wrong reasons. We'll be in the newspapers for delivering good service. So the role of the board, we cannot undermine it. And in fact, at this stage, we've got a good board that we get along with in terms of what we are thinking and what we want to do. But of course, robust discussions. We disagree to agree sometimes, but all in the spirit of trying to improve the service that we are meant to do. I will say we are at a make or break for SAA. It's not jokes time. It's a serious time where every employee, including the board members, we need to be ambassadors of the brand. We need to be salespeople for the brand by how we conduct ourselves and how we receive people that criticize us. We need to go the extra mile to take it as feedback and then be able to improve our service as well. So the role of the board is critical, but more importantly, the board needs to get along with the shareholder, which happens to be the department, and the board needs to find that there is a working chemistry between management. I've been in organizations where the relationship between the board and management doesn't work out, then the organization fails as a whole. So we are quite pleased that at this stage, we've got a board that we work together with. We've got those particular synergies. And this is very important in terms of us really rebuilding this airline.
Lerato, SAA is governed by so many different types of legislation, which makes staying on the straight and narrow quite difficult very often, as I understand it. What will its leadership have to navigate in terms of ensuring it's fully compliant with all the applicable legislation in the future?
Thanks, Joanne. Before I answer that question, can I just add to the previous question that you asked about customer service?
Sure.
And as Tom said also that the SAA is trying to maximize the customer experience by making more use of technology. I also want to emphasize the fact that because we are in the fourth industrial revolution, everything that we do is on the internet, is on computers, and it's quite easy to access some analytics from the customer. So for instance, a good turnaround strategy would be whenever someone has just finished booking a flight, ask them, what do you think about SAA? What do you think about the brand? And, as micro level as it may seem, it can be very helpful when you gather all that data at the end of the day, and then you are able to have a real explanation or interpretation of how customers really feel about you as the entity. So that's one thing that the SAA could take advantage of. Even if people do not finish booking a flight, there can be, questions that ask, why did you not complete the booking? Did you find prices too expensive, or was it because of taste or preferences? Something like that. And then back to your question about issues of legislation and regulation. One thing about the SAA and what makes it very interesting as an entity is that, number one, it's a company. So the purpose of a company is profit maximization. But secondly, it is a state-owned enterprise, which can be used to achieve developmental goals or any political objectives. The fact that it's a national carrier is one of the issues that are attached to developmental agendas. So it is a company that has a dual purpose of making a profit, but also making sure that the South African brand is sustained and has a national carrier that we can all be proud of. And for that, we need to understand that this entity falls within many realms of legislation. So firstly, SAA, according to the PFMA, which is the Public Financial Management Act, it falls under Schedule 2 as a major public entity. So in that sense, anyone that is making any decisions at SAA needs to understand that they need to streamline with regulations at the Treasury or the objectives and outcomes of the PFMA. Secondly, because it's a listed company, it is governed by the Companies Act, which is why we can see that it was easy to make provisions for the SOE to be able to undergo business rescue, because legislatively that option was available under the Chapter 6 of business rescue provisions. Lastly, the SAA falls under, or rather is regulated by the Civil Aviation Authority of South Africa. And as such, the quality of the aircraft, safety, and other codes are things that the entity has to be aware of. So you need board members or leadership who take into cognizance all these issues. So for instance, if they say they want to buy a new aircraft, is that aircraft compliant with all the legislation that is governed by the Aviation Authority? If so, is it in line with the principles of the PFMA to not have wasteful expenditure? If so, under the Companies Act, is it also following those regulations? So it's important for any board member to understand that when you come into that space, you don't just come with knowledge of aviation, you don't just come with knowledge of an SOE. All of those have to be merged together. And for you to understand that before you make any significant decisions, you need to understand and make sure that all those boxes are ticked so as to avoid issues of unethical conduct or issues of audit findings in the future. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Lerato. I want to go to our audience questions in a moment, but there are a couple of quick issues that I need to get in. Actually, both of them center on this deal or around this deal that is on the cards with the Takatso equity stake. Is that a done deal, Thomas? Are there several other processes which lie ahead? Very quickly.
Not a done deal. Where we are now is that as it has been announced, it is a potential strategic equity partner who had to do what we call a due diligence. And then subsequent to a due diligence, you get into what we call your share purchase agreement, meaning that you're quite happy with what you saw out of the due diligence, and now you need to start getting into the main matters. So where we are now is that we're done with the due diligence, and there's that negotiation that is taking place on the share purchase agreement. I just want to mention something quickly, and I'll come to this point around regulation. You see, regulation is an important thing. It holds us accountable. We are responsible for public money, and then we need to be compliant with that. But the unintended consequences of regulation is that the lack of agility on the market. The people I compete with, they're only looking at the Companies Act. They don't have PFMA. If they want to procure something to improve a customer service, they do it overnight. I have to then go through a process of doing a tender, and then at some point it gets cancelled. It will take 2 months. So as much as a regulation is good, there is this unintended consequences, and generally it stifles a lot of agility, especially in a very highly competitive market like aviation as well. But in terms of the deal, again, we are just waiting for that particular process of getting into a share purchase agreement to then be completed, and then the shareholder can advise us on a way forward. But generally, a deal like this will still be subject to the things like your competition commission. They need to have a look at that, and those processes can be complex and can take time as well.
So Andile, what Thomas is alluding to there is exactly what some of my concerns could be about the interesting sort of leadership difficulties that might come along if this Takatso deal goes through. You've got leaders from two entirely different worlds. Should the deal be approved, can the public and private sector work together efficiently, in your opinion, Andile?
It's always in the, Joe, it's always on if they have the will to do that. But that will, of course, emanate from one appreciating that if you go solo, kind of, particularly in this kind of environment that we are, you kind of shooting yourself in the foot. You are hamstring your own business performance. I would say that the important thing is that a call has got to be made. that we want to collaborate, we want to do this. When you have done that, it becomes easy then, because at conceptual stage, you have made that decision, really operationalizing, if you will, then it becomes not that difficult. You often find, what's the word, the restrictions or the reluctance or the challenges, because the will is not there, the appreciation that we need to put hands together with partners out there, it's not going to happen. It's going to make it difficult. We need really to appreciate that, which is what we have as an academic now, Joe, if you will, allow me. We do appreciate that fact that as the academics that generating knowledge, the epistemic value, you're not going to go by yourself. You need other people, because we formulate sense of what happens around through interaction with other people, through the perceptions and the assumptions of other people. So knowledge generation is actually fluid, the process itself and the knowledge itself. So the sooner one appreciates that it's only when we come together that we're going to make a real impact to the challenges out there, the better. So that will be my advice, that a will has got to be there. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks very much, Andile. Let's take some of those questions from our viewers right now. Jeremiah Mudamba has sent this through. I think I'm going to ask you to answer this, please, Thomas. He says, among the challenges affecting SOEs are the lack of real independence of directors from political influence and limited real authority of the leadership from political authority. Will these two challenges be addressed in this case?
Our understanding of the deal, if we look at it going forward, is that the private consortium will have 51%, meaning that the 51%, then they will have a majority in the board. That is the understanding of the expectation as well. I think that can be achieved. Also, look, yes, it is a problem in terms of sometimes we don't have that independence from a directorship point of view in the public sector entities. There are some entities in the public sector as well who've got good directors as well who are independent as well. But yes, we do have it as a challenge. But we believe that should the deal be approved, it will give us that added value of having people who are not in the state coming through to be part of the board of SAA.
Thanks, Thomas. Lerato, I'm going to ask you to answer this one, please. It's from Kenny Shela, who says, important points to consider when it comes to state-owned companies are the following. Number one, do we see these entities as enablers that create value for commercial enterprises like hotels, malls, and business in general? Number two, do we see these entities, SAA in this instance, as commercial ventures that should compete on an equal footing with private sector players? So it's a choice between the Emirates approach, enabler, or Delta, commercial entity driven purely by profits. What's your take on that, Lerato?
It goes back to what I said initially, that a state-owned entity is so interesting because it's not only a profit maximizer, but it is supposed to achieve some kinds of developmental goals. So, like Thomas has said, that the problems with SAA were not really in asking whether the entity is. Sorry, can I just rephrase this? The problem was not really that the entity was a write-off or anything like that. The problem was an issue of insolvency. So it was an issue of assets versus liabilities. But if you look at the contribution that the entity makes to the economy, it's quite significant, even though its revenues against its losses makes it seem like it's not a viable enterprise. So I'll give another example, for instance, of the World Cup. I mean, we can imagine how much the air traffic was, because we basically had people from everywhere. And even though they would travel with other airlines that are competing with SAA, eventually SAA obviously did make a lot of money out of that. So in that sense, SAA is not, it's not just an enabler. And that's why I was saying that it's important to hold more dialogues like these and to actually understand the issues of the carrier even more. Look at your documents from Treasury, look at your PFMAs, look at everything that legislates the entity, and then you'll see that there's a lot to salvage. Jobs as well. There are a lot of people who are working at the SAA. So if we just say, let's just hand over the entity, or let's just go for full privatization and disregard the role of the state, then we are losing that value. Thanks.
Thanks, Lerato. A couple of questions here for you, Thomas. One from Joshua, who says, you have so many stakeholders, the government, the board, unions, staff, suppliers, regulators, etc. As a leader, how do you instill a willing following with so many parties? Where do you even start? I think it's a great question.
You don't sleep at night. Look, a good question. One of the key things around this role as well, it needs that high level of EQ, if I may put it that way. You need to sit down and understand the role of each stakeholder. Your customer, very important, you're servicing them. The regulator gives you that safety assurance because we are in a very a complex market as well. You need to look at the government as a point of governance, a point of policy as well, and you need to appreciate the value they bring on the book. You need to look at your board. You need to look at your employees. I really love my employees. I think we've got fantastic employees at SAA, and they are the ones who are really driving this brand very strong. So the one thing you need to understand is the value add by each stakeholder, and also allow yourself to spend time with them and also be able to get their perspective of how they see the business. And what am I getting to? I'm getting to a point of a collective ownership of the business. Of course, as the CEO, I'm accountable for running the day-to-day operations, but I do speak to the employees. When I speak to the employees, I say, we are all ambassadors. Let's go sell the business. What is it that we can do better? So you need that collective ownership. The problem starts when you start owning this thing in isolation and undermining other stakeholders. So they are very important. But the one thing I must say is that a lot of stakeholders doesn't make it easy to manage. You need to have patience. You need to engage. And sometimes things don't go the way that you expect them to go. But you need to be, one of the things I encourage in our teams, that let's be transparent. Because when you're transparent, you build trust. And when you build trust, it's much easier to navigate through stakeholders. It will always be difficult if there is no trust amongst the stakeholders.
Thanks, Thomas. Andile, here's a question for you from Joshua. Given the challenges of leading in these uncertain times, is academia taking real-life learnings and updating your curricula to adequately equip the modern leader? I think that's such an important point because I think a lot of academic schools and business schools in particular are struggling with this right now. They don't really know how to fuse what's going on out there in the real world with the kind of student that the knowledge that the student will require in order to be useful once he, she, they enter that world.
Quite a good question, Joe, because that's exactly what we're on. We do appreciate that we're not going to walk this journey being just an epistemic center that is by its own. That's why you hear us talking about the partnership and the collaborations and presence in the industry out there. As I said, no single entity, no single person can really claim exclusivity to the generation of knowledge. And that then means that what we've got to do as the academic institutions, and this is what we're doing at UNISA, we carry this out through engaged scholarships that says we do appreciate that there are problems out there, and the way to solve them is not really through the academic lens, but it is appreciating that if you marry the two, if you marry your academic posture with the industry experience there and work together so that we begin to derive a joint understanding of what needs to be done. And when we derive that kind of understanding, when we derive those kind of best practices of how to go about, we start making sure that we distribute those. They cut across all sectors and are within the centers. And at the SPL, the emphasis is, for instance, is through the business leadership clinic that I alluded to in the beginning. That's the platform, that's the environment that we want to make sure that our students, we afford them this kind of opportunity, this kind of environment where they're actually solving the real issues. So they really draw on what is happening in the academically speaking and solve the real issues. If SAA is complaining about the operational structure, if they're complaining about the working capital, what's the best way that our graduates should be able to demonstrate their firm grasp of all the business functions and how the financial perspective make an impact on those business functions other than working in a real life case scenario. So that's really what we're driving at the business school.
Andile, thank you so much. So you heard it here first. Before SAA is even airborne again, there are many more installments to come in the narrative of SAA, no doubt. For now, we wait to see what the future holds for the flagship carrier and whether it is possible for a full turnaround to be made successfully. Thank you to all our panel members for their insights, and thank you for watching and for participating in these Business Day Dialogues live in partnership with UNISA SPL. We look forward to many more stimulating discussions in the weeks ahead. From me, Jan Joseph, take care. Bye-bye.